First of all, the three of us, currently have the privilege of residing on Galiano Island, which is one of the islands in the archipelago that you know as the San Juans. And as a result, we share our gratitude to be speaking about and from the territories of the Coast Salish peoples. We are very grateful for the opportunity to live and learn and talk together about these lands that we love very deeply, and about which we are concerned in our little book, Rising Tides, which is, what a horrible segue into a commercial, which is available for sale, sorry, not for sale, which is available on your way out for a $20 donation to the Wet'suwet'en, the Unistoten camp. You will be able to take a hot off the press copy of Rising Tides with you. My name is Catriona Sandilands. Thank you very much. Is it Stefan or Stefan?
Yes.
Stefan. And to our other hosts, Natalie Baloy from Western Washington, for hosting us at this, and to Huxley College, to the Salish Sea Institute, and to the university for hosting us today. The title of the session is Story and Climate Change in the Salish Sea, which is a title that is loosely based on a project that we have all participated in, that was funded by the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, not Justin, the other one. So not the one who's currently being an SOB, the other guy, his dad. Founded by the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation for a project called Story and Climate Change. I'm delighted also to introduce Andrew Simon and Lauren Magner, who are two contributors to the volume. And we are going to be we're going to be sharing our relationship to the book, and we're also going to be giving you a little sense of the diversity of some of the writings that are involved in this book. Essentially, the project emerged. So I'm a professor of environmental studies, but I teach in the field of environmental humanities, which is sort of a broadly interdisciplinary humanities-based collection that starts from the premise and continues to ask questions about what is the role of the arts and the humanities in thinking about complex ecological questions. So thinking about, as we talked about this morning, invasive species, thinking about climate change, thinking about the Anthropocene in a general sense, thinking about questions of urbanization and sprawl and population. What is the role of the humanities in formulating ways of talking about some of these problems, ways of understanding some of these problems, ways of popularizing some of these problems, and ways of perhaps developing new forms of conversation. So this book began with the premise that that we are not doing a very good job as literary critics. We are not doing a very good job in general of telling good stories about climate change. We are used to thinking about climate change as this really big thing. I'm not sure if you remember Al Gore, the film Inconvenient Truth with Al Gore on the cherry picker. That's as good a story as we've been able to get. It was a really good piece of drama, but it tends to leave people thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do in response? There's this huge epochal scale, geological scale problem of climate change. How are we as individuals and as communities going to respond to that? Literary fiction, or fiction in general, creative writing about climate change has tended to be spearheaded by folks in the realm who write in the realm of speculative fiction. So the genre of cli-fi has come into being as a result of literary writers, sci-fi writers trying to grapple with questions of climate change, which is absolutely great. There is some really wonderful climate fiction out there. You are probably familiar with that woman, what's her name, Margaret Atwood, who is a relatively well-known Canadian author. She's written some very powerful books the Mad Adam trilogy, Oryx and Crake, The Year of the Flood, Mad Adam, which are very much about the complex of relations around climate change. Another one that I would recommend very highly to you is called The Marrow Thieves by Cherie de Maline, which is a very beautiful young adult novel which demonstrates a uniquely indigenous perspective on climate change. But these are works of speculative fiction, and they tend, although I've noted recently that the futurity of climate change is getting closer and closer. They tend to place climate change as an apocalyptic thing that is going to happen in the future. As somebody who does a lot of reading and writing about fiction in general, about poetry, about realist fiction that is set in the present day, I wondered where were the stories that were about where we are now? Where were the ways of speaking together that were actually creating works of art around the things that we're seeing in the present, not things that we might expect to see in 50 years' time. So the project involved a workshop on Galliano Island in March 2018, in which an assortment of climate experts, ranging from local activists and organizers to literary writers to climate scientists to people from other university disciplines, the social sciences and humanities, all of whom were working in the field of climate change in some way or another. We all got together for a 4-day workshop on Galliano Island, in which we talked about the kinds of stories that we thought needed to be told about climate change, in which we talked about some of the very specific effects of climate change that we saw and still see underway in the Salish Sea region, on Galliano in particular, and in which we actually did some writing work together. I'm delighted to say that at the end of that 4-day workshop, we didn't actually agree on anything. Not surprising, you get 35 really smart people together in a room. To expect that we're going to agree at the end of the day is probably kind of pushing it. But for me as an editor, what that means is that this book, which was the next step in the project, there is no one answer to that question. What kinds of stories do we need to be telling about climate change? There are some people who felt very, very strongly that the stories that they wanted to write, the stories that they wanted to tell, needed to involve making the very best and most recent climate science palpable and understandable and visceral. And there are others who felt that the process of storytelling needed to actually dig deeper and talk about some of the causes of climate change. So talking about petrocapitalism, talking about our addiction to oil, talking about colonialism, talking about climate change as a longer historical project, in which we can also talk about the relationship between the decline of the buffalo and the Dust Bowl, which is also a form of climate change. So everybody went away, decided what kind of stories that they wanted to tell, and then in 2 words or less, I helped and a little team of poets and other writers who are much better than I, edited them into this volume. There are 42 contributions of poetry and fiction and memoir, and other forms of literary nonfiction, and it was published by Caitlin Press, which is a small press from the Sunshine Coast of British Columbia, in October. And the next step in the project is to take the book on tour with contributors, and in many places with members of the local writing and artistic community, to talk about, to ask the same kinds of questions that we asked at the workshop. What kinds of stories do we need to be telling about climate change? What are the climate stories that are particularly resonant and visceral in the particular place in which we are speaking? And how do we think about the forms of writing that might best express might best express some of those questions. So that's the longest I'm going to talk. That is the introduction to the project. What we'd like to do for the rest of our time is to, Lauren and Andrew who wrote, I confess I'm not supposed to talk about what my favorite contributions to the book are, but Lauren and Andrew's is actually one of my favorite contributions to the book. And they're going to talk a little bit about their piece and their writing process and some of the things that they wanted to say with their particular contribution to the book. They're going to talk about that, and then we are each going to choose a piece by somebody else. And we've all got our choices, and we've all got rationales behind our choices, and we're going to do just a little bit of a reading from those three pieces. And then what I'd like to do is open up the floor to a conversation about the kinds of stories that you think we need to be, well, of course, I'd like to hear your responses to the book, but I'd love to hear and engage you in conversation about what you think about the relationship between storytelling and climate change, what kinds of stories you think need to be told, what you think about the idea of writing fiction about climate change when we are already immersed in a very fact-based world in which climate change is already upon us, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to pass the floor over to you two, and I'll go over there. Okay.
Thank you, Kate.
Okay. Well, first of all, it was my pleasure. It was a great delight to have the opportunity to participate in this project. But if our goal was to, in contributing, create a new way to talk about climate change, then I think it's a very interesting one, maybe a little bit awkward, because we contributed a key, a technical key to the conifers of Galiano Island that was set into the future, to the year 2150. So I'm just going to speak briefly about how that idea came about. That's really set against the background of my work. I'm an ecologist. I study at UVic. I'm just finishing up my master's right now on pollinator ecology. And I also curate a project on Galiano Island called the Biodiversity Galiano Project, which is a community-based biodiversity project that's intended to create meaningful opportunities for community members to contribute to biodiversity research. My throat's and I, at the time, was working on sort of a sub-project of that, was just organizing the knowledge I had gathered over the years about the conifers of the island into a set of technical keys. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with what those are, but it's just a way of organizing knowledge about a particular taxonomic group. It could be any group of organisms in terms of the similarities and differences between them. And people use them as a means of identifying them. So I was just doing this to take all that I knew about the conifers and make that knowledge explicit, because after a while you become familiar with things and you eventually take it for granted how it is that you know what this and that is. And so that's how it began, and it began in a very different place than where it went in the way of our contribution to this anthology. And it actually came about largely because Lauren had a good idea about how it could be, I guess,
Right.
adapted.
Yeah, kind of after an attempt at literary nonfiction, we, I guess, had a few meandering short story type of thing. But that came up with some creative challenges. So to avoid it, I thought, hey, Andrew's working. I was inspired by what Andrew was doing and thought, hey, what would happen if we set this key in the future? Yeah.
To try and imagine what these conifers might look like on the landscape after another 150 years of climate change.
Yeah, and then make it work for our piece in the anthology. Yeah.
So one of the challenges of that project from the outset, for me as a scientist, I struggled a lot with my skepticism, because there's so much uncertainty about how these different species might adapt to climate change in the future. And as it turns out, skepticism doesn't always contribute to the best literary effect. So I just really struggled with, like, for example, what's going to become of Western red cedar, because you hear so many of these really dire stories about, where it might vanish within 50 to 100 years. And I don't really follow that. I think that it's probably going to adapt and probably remain in some pockets of the landscape in the future. But nevertheless, if you want to create a literary effect with a piece, you're trying to, I guess, find some sweet spot in between skepticism and some of these more dramatic possible futures.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you may notice we're not reading directly from the piece, the piece because of its form. So it was a bit it was challenging to write, and is also challenging to read. Another challenge of how to imagine how people in the future are going to learn, and what kind of relationships they're going to have with the place, with this place specifically, because it is a specific guide to a specific place. And what that landscape might look like. So we've included the indigenous place and plant names, and in addition to Latin names. So we have this kind of colonial scientific structure with counterpoints that we're hoping helps in work to do some decolonizing. Yeah. So some questions. We've written it in the formal style of botanical flora, adopting both Western and indigenous nomenclature. These keys are as much an artifact of a colonial past as they are a guide for an unknown future. How will these conifers appear before us a century from now? How will we recognize them and call them by name? Whose names will we use, and what knowledge systems will guide us? These are some of the questions that lie between the lines of the following keys.
Yeah, with that, we invite you to have a go at trying to read what we wrote for this edition.
We have the shore pine, the ponderosa pine, the western white pine, the western hemlock, the grand fir, the Douglas fir, the western yew, the seaside juniper, and the western red cedar. And some neat things, we also referenced the work of an amazing ethnobotanist, Nancy Turner, who you should all know, is a super gentle, very amazing person who's done a lot of work with First Nations people and with plants. I don't think, we could have written this without without work that she's done, and obviously accessing knowledge that has been around for time immemorial. Do you want to play with the yew, the bow?
Okay, yeah, so we struggled a lot in terms of how to prioritize names in this, and with the use of the technical key as a framework. And so we had to make a decision on whether to lead with the indigenous names or to follow, and we decided we would follow because we thought that would be more impactful. Some of the descriptions, they bring us into an encounter with an interesting place of similarity between worldviews, I suppose, and there's a good example in in Taxus brevifolia, the western yew. It was interesting to learn that the Hulcametanum name means bow tree, but also in the Latin, Taxus refers to the bow. And so to have, we reflected a lot on how Western approaches to knowing might diverge a lot from indigenous ways, but in some ways, certainly in our encounters with these living beings on the landscape, we might find that there's a lot more in common than we might suppose otherwise.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Kate will read her piece, or the piece she's chosen.
Sure.
So, one of the reasons I love that piece so much is that it's actually speculative nonfiction. It's taking this very rigid form of a dichotomous key and using it as a way of exploring questions about what not just what species are going to be there, but how we're going to explore the relationships between Western and Indigenous knowledges in this future moment. So while almost all of the species in this key have an established Hulkaminam name, one of them does not, because it's not currently found in the region. And the speculation is that it will be found, the ponderosa pine, which is currently a warmer and drier species, right? So I'm not the botanist. So by whose name will we know this plant in this place in the future? And I just thought that was the most brilliant way of encapsulating in extraordinarily briefly what was some of the problems around knowledge and relationship that we're going to be tackling on the island in the future as different species, as some species leave, some species change their form, and new species arrive. And I think that that might be particularly clear on a small island, but I think is actually going to be a problem that we're going to be facing in a very large sense. How are we going to have relationships with these new ecologies that are going to come into being? Which is why it's one of my favorite pieces. So there is, however, an enormous variety of other questions that these very, very brief works are asking. None of the works in this volume is over 2,000 words. So this is a volume that is meant that it has a structure, it has an order, but it's actually sort of meant to be read like you would eat a box of chocolates. You can go through and just sample one and think about it one day, rather than imagine that you're going to plow through the whole thing. That said, I used this book to teach my undergraduate environmental writing course this year. So what I did was I pulled out the different genres of writing and organized our exploration about storytelling and climate change around questions of genre. So we had a day, for example, we had a day about poetry in which we compared and contrasted some of the different poems in the book. Some of them are very short poems, some of them are very long poems. Many of them are poems that are in 3 or 4 parts. And we had a couple of days in which we looked at intimate first-person memoir. We had a day in which we looked at questions of perspective. So some of the nonfiction pieces are actually quite journalistic. Some of the other nonfiction pieces are very, very, very personal. So one is told in the form of a diary. One is told in the form of something that could easily be an op-ed piece in a major newspaper. My favorite day was the day that we pulled out all of the short stories. So all of the short fiction about climate change. And in my group of undergraduate students, I asked them by the end of the class, it was sort of like, we have this thing in Canada called Canada Reads. And it's there are 5 books. It happens on CBC Radio. There are 5 books that are duking it out for the book that everybody in the country needs to read. Each book has a champion, and at the end of the day, one gets chosen. Well, I got my class to do that with the short stories. They each had to gather together in little groups and figure out a way of arguing which story was going to be the one that they were going to make everybody, that we were going to require for them to take home for Thanksgiving weekend for everybody to read. And so I'm going to read you a little piece from the story that won. And it's a short story called Underfolk by a wonderful author named David Hubert. David Hubert is a wonderful poet, short story writer. He has a brilliant book called Peninsula Sinking. And it is, this is a short story that's actually excerpted from what is going to be a young adult novel called Sick Harbor. And I'm just going to read you the very beginning of that story. Mum asked what I wanted to be for Halloween, and I told her one of the underfolk, the creatures who live in the tidal flats. We were walking around the waterfront, and there was a cruise ship pulling in, a big white top hat on the black still sea. Underfolk? Yeah. What are they? Sea creatures, sort of, amphibians. They're like household sprites, but with tongues made of seaweed and barnacle eyes. Household sprites. Yeah, sprites, like gnomes, but helpful. Well, seaweed and barnacle eyes, very imaginative. Where did you learn about these underfolk? Sam told me about them. Mum frowned. It was a frown I knew well, a frown related to Sam, a frown that meant she thought I was acting troubled again, that she wore when Mr. Humphreys said I was still in the denial phase. We left it at that. Stood together looking up at the cruise ship, 17 stories of white, and on top the climbing wall and a crane with a viewing bubble and a big green inflatable giraffe. In the summer, the cruise ships come and go, and then the locals sell them fish and chips, beads and bracelets. I've often wondered what it's like to be that high out over the ocean, so high up you can't even see the waves anymore, just the flat, endless blue. Sam and I used to talk about climbing up the balconies and stowing away on board. Harbor Street was full of women tanned bright orange, men in colorful shirts and white running shoes. It was high tide, as it had to be for the cruise ships to come in. On the other side of the harbor, tankers were picking up payloads from the refineries. We stood at the railing, and Mum spoke toward the ocean. So, how serious are you about dressing up as an underfolk? There's no singular for the word folk. She grinned and meant it. That's my little dictionary. I just say an underperson. Couldn't you just be a TV again? We still have the costume. Or remember last year when you were Garth and Sam was Wayne? I watched Mum realize she'd made a mistake. A foghorn sounded in the distance, and we stood holding the guardrail and staring out over the Black Sea. A pop bottle bobbed against the jetty, kissed a cube of styrofoam. Mum once told me she used to see seals and porpoises in the harbor, but I'd never seen anything but trash and seagulls and diesel rainbows. Maybe I'll just stay home. Mum sucked her teeth. A tanker slumped across the calm harbor, slid through the breakwater, and on through the blameless black.
Thank you, Kate. Okay. I will tease you with a portion of a poem called Hidden Layers by Reed Osler. In her own words, Reed Osler is a parks naturalist and environmental educator with over 19 years' experience leading programs in parks, protected areas, and other wild spaces. She is currently the education coordinator at the Galliano Conservancy Association, where she facilitates day and multi-day hands-on environmental education programs for both youth and adults. She includes a number of creative pursuits in her programs, including writing, song, and theater. So I chose it because it's one of my favorites in the book, because Reed is connected to what is currently referred to as Galliano and Parker Islands that are situated in the Salish Sea. And I chose it because it deeply embodies the spaces between those islands and the place and who lives in them. And I thought that related well and very much embodied the spirit of the Story in Climate Change project. So Hidden Layers is a poem in two parts. The first is called Whatever Impacts the Ocean or Anything Living in the Ocean Will Impact Us. The second part, which I will read today, is called Glass Sponges Filter the How sound in 1 year, the entire body of water. A world where hands can't go, eyes can't see, lungs can't breathe. A world full of ancient animals masquerading as plants, animals towering above the seafloor, glass condominiums 8 stories high, feasting on bacteria in a sea so vast they remain unseen. Skeletal silica structures silently building reefs on a barren seafloor, sheltering finned ones, shelled ones, many-leggeds, swimming in and out of glass fingers. Once thought to be extinct, rediscovered not long ago. Where only submarines can reach, they gather in dark depths, blown into different shapes, cloud glass sponges, tubular, glowing columns, finger goblets, ethereal, otherworldly forms, anchored to rocks or other sponges, spreading into cities. Beneath turbulent waves, they pull in salty brine, pump it out again, in and out for millennia, cleaning these waters. Waters that generations fed from and journeyed on, invisible threads tracing back in time, and out into the future, beyond vision, offering silent thanks for abundance to ones they could not see. Small creatures, houses of glass, filtering the sea. Now the surface reaches down, touches the deep, glass gardens, still invisible to many not shielded from those warmer, more acidic waters that slow their pumping down. A ripple from the depths reaches out, asking us to look beneath, asking us to see. Thank you.
Okay. So I chose to read excerpts from a piece of nonfiction. Is that true? Yeah. And it's by Sarah Barron. So climate change is this really difficult subject that many of us struggle with in our daily lives, and yet we know that the world over, it disproportionately affects a lot of people who are in less privileged situations. So perhaps some of us carry a greater burden of responsibility in speaking to that subject, sometimes in simple, sometimes maybe radical ways, to work toward carrying that burden in a more fair and equitable way. I chose this piece because of the perspectives it represents, and I think it's fair to say it's a relatively privileged perspective through the eyes of a climate scientist, and yet one who's also a mother, sorry. And it's a piece that speaks to an audience that is perhaps the most difficult audience that we have to face. That is the face of future generations. This piece I chose not only for what it does have to say about climate change, but also for what it doesn't say, or perhaps can't. So, as a climate change researcher, I have steadfastly avoided one audience for my work, my own kids. How do I talk to my children about what we are facing? Do I want to reveal my sadness and fear to their growing hearts? When will they be ready for this conversation? Unfortunately, the talk came earlier than I hoped. My 8-year-old son, Elliot, was on spring break from school this year, so he came to the urban forestry class I was teaching at the University of British Columbia. Elliot has been to my class many times, and it is usually fine. He plays Minecraft quietly in the back of the room, while the class talks about trees. On this occasion, though, I overlooked the fact that the guest lecturer was there to talk about climate change and climate-adapted tree species. The speaker told us about deaths, both human and arboreal, resulting from summer heat waves. 54 people last summer in Quebec who did not have access to cool or shade. Hundreds of trees in our region, especially cedars, Elliot's favorites, that did not have enough water. After class, on the way to pick up his little sister from daycare, out of the contemplative silence in the back of the car came a gentle question. Mom, are you worried about climate change? Climate change isn't something I can fully wrap my head around. It is too scary, too big. So in forming my answer for my son, I reflected on the crutch I use for myself. To keep from despondency, I try to focus on a contracted issue, one that confronts the challenges climate change poses for us. But that also brings hope, perhaps the possibility of agency in the midst of the problem's enormity. For me, this issue is urban trees. So she goes on to talk about the cherry trees and how they're responding to climate change in Vancouver. I find hope in our cherry trees' resolve to live on the front line of climate extremes, but I am also cautious about its ability to survive in our future city. In the Pacific Northwest, predicted weather changes will alter water availability throughout the year. Hotter summers will be coupled with longer summer drought and intenser windstorms, and rainfall will saturate soils, while milder winters will reduce winter snowpack and spring freshet. This year, the mild early winter in Vancouver almost decimated the cherry blossoms. They need a certain number of cold nights per year for optimal flowering. This trait evolved to prevent blossoms from opening before a late frost. Thankfully for the cherries, 2019 brought a record-breaking cold February, allowing our city to enjoy another sakura season. Despite its uncertain future, our cherry tree is doing more than we are to mitigate climate change. Within its twisted trunk, the tree stores carbon. Every year, it absorbs a small amount of the emissions we create as a city. Larger trees absorb exponentially more carbon than smaller ones, which makes sense if you think about the sheer volume of leaf and branch found on mature trees. We need to protect the arboreal veterans in our cities. It might be appealing to cut down our middle-aged cherry tree, what with its pesky roots, to plant something more obedient in its place. We would mourn the loss of our friend. Even more urgently, we simply don't have time to wait for new young trees to grow. In the precious hours of my children's lives spent in the car every day, we are lucky at least to drive through urban forests. We were driving through one of them when Elliot, looking out at the blurred green, asked his question about climate change. I can imagine his big blue eyes registering a trunk or branch for a split second as the car drove by, a temporary blink away from his dream world. I wish that my children had more opportunity to climb trees, to wrap their small arms around trunks and branches, to use their toes to reach and grip as they pull themselves upward, testing the tree's strength along with their own. But this moment is better than nothing. As I prepared to answer my son, I thought about the swing over the cherry tree's root, and that we should take a family walk to it tonight. I also thought about a movie we recently watched as a family, in Hayao Miyazaki's anime film, My Neighbor Totoro, a story about two young girls' relationships with the spirits of the trees. The father tells his children that people and trees used to be such good friends. The film evokes some of the sadness of the lost relationships we once shared with trees. At the same time, it brings hope that the bonds can be restored. This is the message I want to share with my children. We have lost our connection and continue to make mistakes, but there is still opportunity to once again be good friends with trees. If we can be friends, I hold out hope that we will find a way to face the new, difficult future together. Planting and caring for a tree, especially an urban tree, is a concrete contribution to forging friendship, a way to keep going forward in climate-changing times. I took a deep breath and answered Elliot's question.
So I think we have 5 minutes. We have a few minutes for your thoughts on the project, for your thoughts about the kinds of very local climate stories that are appearing in front of you. Questions, comments, really anything. The floor is yours. Yes.
What is your guys' extent of the book tour?
A little louder, please.
The extent of the book tour, where all are you headed?
That's a good question. The book tour is limited by several factors: budget, energy level, and my deep sense of contradiction in the idea of flying back and forth across the country to talk about climate change. So my life, as you might have gathered, is kind of bi-locational. In the fall, I was in teaching in Southern Ontario. We did a series of events in Southern Ontario. This spring, I'm mostly located on the West Coast, so we're doing a series of events on the West Coast. In April, I'm actually going to take a page out of Greta Thunberg's book and do a little train trip to go through Quebec and Atlantic Canada. And I might, I'm scheduled to go to a couple of places in the Eastern Seaboard, but I'm not entirely sure I'm going to be doing that at this point. So I would like to go to New York. I would like to go to Massachusetts. I'd like to go to Rhode Island. I'm not entirely sure that's going to happen. What I think in the other thing that we're going to do as a result of a suggestion that we got at one of the book events was to get people to do very short, 2 to 3 minute, as many contributors as want to contribute, to do 2 to 3 minute readings that we will then post online on the Story and Climate Change website. So we will be able to have people, sort of hear a selection of the stories remotely. It won't be quite the same thing as having an in-person conversation, but it will be a little bit less painfully hypocritical.
One of the challenges of climate change is the scientists end up preaching to the choir in terms of who listens to the Do you think that the humanities can do a better job, and how do you present that book so that it's not just preaching to the choir?
I think that's a really interesting question. One of the I think Andrew and Lauren also have things to say, but one of the intents behind the book was to not preach to the choir. So some of these stories, one of the criticisms that has come actually from the choir is that some of these stories are not as obviously about climate change as they should be, and that's entirely intentional. Some of the stories are very small. They rely on a range of different kinds of experience. The Underfolk story is actually, as you may have gathered, about a young boy. It is about a young boy grappling with the death of his older brother. You get from the short story a very strong sense that death is that he's dying of some obscure childhood cancer, and that is probably environmentally related. And there's the cruise ship, and there's the mother, and there's the refinery, but it's not actually telling you what to think about climate change. So that's one thing that I think the humanities can do very well, or at least the storytelling project can do very well, is start to talk about climate change and to talk about real lived experiences in a way that doesn't preach. There's a difference between a good story and a sermon. And I think there's a real role, there's a role for sermons, absolutely, but there's a real role for good stories. And those are ones that one of the contributors to this book, Dylan Harris, just last week defended his doctoral dissertation on story and climate change. And for him, he interviewed storytellers in Appalachia and Alaska, and that was their lesson to climate scientists and people in the humanities, was that you have to, when you're telling a good story, you are leaving enough space for people to find their own truth in it rather than being told what the truth is. And that's risky because, as we know, some people whose whose names we might not choose to mention in this room right now are very, very good storytellers, and not in a good way.
There was, during the workshop, there was a contributor, Ashley Consuelo, who is based in the Labrador, the east coast of Canada. And she has a contribution here under the heading What We Have Lost. And I was so inspired to hear part of what she was working on is the emotional response to climate change. Grief, really. And so some of what humanities and art and poetry can do is process grief, sadness, anxiety, and also provide hope. I believe that's why I feel like I have to the modus operandi I have to operate under to exist in our in the world.
Your question kind of reached toward the, well, what it called to mind for me is a quote, and I can't cite the climate scientist, but I'm sure many of us have heard it, that I used to think that climate change and biodiversity loss and so forth were the world's greatest problems, but I came to realize that, in fact, human apathy, greed, and so forth are the real problems, and we scientists don't know how to respond to that. We don't know what to do about that. And I didn't read those sections of my piece, but that's partly why I did read it, because this woman, this mother, the climate scientist, it's very interesting where she goes in thinking about how to respond to her child. She's reflecting on this tree, and I wrote mostly about the trees and their biological response to climate change, but she actually goes a lot more into depth about the human relationship to the tree and what's being lost in that way. And so, yeah, I think that the humanities has a really important role to play there, just in reaching and touching people in a less direct and emotional way.
I just have one question, and sort of ties in with Stefan's question. So obviously, climate change oftentimes is, again, preaching to the choir. And, while there's a lot of great methods about it, a lot of people find it controversial or just so heavy and intense it goes over their heads. Obviously, with the book, a little bit of a different story. But with being a relatively new publication and from a publishing company, which is a little on the smaller side, number one, what is your target audience if you have one? And number two is, how are you planning to really get the book out there and to push people to read it and to discuss about it in order to really really just sort of to get more of the climate change story out there into the general public and not just to those who have climate change background and science background.
Super good question. It would be much easier if I had a contract with Houghton Mifflin to publicize this book. I'm delighted to say that another Galliano author, Michael Christie, his novel Greenwood, which is also a climate change book of an interesting sort, has taken off. So there is a market for these stories. Maybe it's not this book. All right, I can live with that. The target market was actually for people who might pick up the book on the BC ferries. So somebody who might have a little bit of an interest and who would not necessarily want to commit to a big fat novel like Greenwood, which of course came out after, well, just before, after it went to press, after this went to press, who might just like a nice little book about climate change, so that they can read, maybe read some stories on the beach. I'm interested in the book is designed to appeal to somebody who wouldn't necessarily gravitate to a book on climate change, and that's why the subtitle is actually Reflections on Climate Changing Times. It doesn't claim to be about climate change, and you can open the book anywhere and there's no one screaming at you. Not that scientists scream at you. But it's not, the stories are actually unusual. They're not the sort of thing that people immediately associate with climate change storytelling. It's not an apocalyptic after the end of the world kind of book. The answer is so this is a small press, what am I going to do with those conditions? I'm going to buy up as many, before my grant runs out, I'm going to buy up as many copies of the book as I possibly can and send it to little local public libraries all across Canada, and bits of the States if they would like them.
Daniel?
You spoke to the role of the humanities in helping people develop language with which to deal with this issue, which I really resonate with in terms of the humanities helping facilitate understanding and dialogue. But at the same time, I want to question, in terms of use of language, I want to question the term climate change. Amongst the climate activists that I work with, the term climate change is not really used anymore. It's seen as either archaic or intentionally misleading or some combination of the two. And so if we think about this as a climate change issue, it doesn't speak to urgency, really. It speaks to change. Change happens, whatever.
Crisis.
And so I'm curious how the choice of that language was made, and if there was some strategy behind the term climate change as opposed to something more like climate crisis.
Yes. Did you? No, that's I can't fob that question off on Andrew and Lauren. Number one, the proposal for the book went to press. Went to the press, and the proposal for the grant went to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation in 2016. So at that moment, people were talking about climate change. I think I might emphasize, although I probably wouldn't change the title of the book, which is Climate Changing Times, rather than Stories About Climate Emergency. I think I would have in my introduction directly talked about that issue. What is the difference? Why is the language of climate change not adequate to think about these times? Maybe we need to think about times of climate crisis, times of climate emergency. So it is. Although I think it's okay that the book doesn't use that language, I would have wanted to talk about it straight up in the introduction.
Rising tides gets us there a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe in terms of.
Okay, we still have the room for people. Feel free to come down and talk informally.
And
Thank you.
please do buy a book for donate to the Unistoten camp, to the Wet'suwet'en. Thank you very much for having us.